Okay, I'm going to speak for about half an hour about some of my experiences in China, the Far East, over the last 12 years. I was director at Farrells in London for 10 years, and then for the last 2.5 years or so in Hong Kong, working mainly on the mainland. And then in the beginning of the year, I've set up my own consultancy, and I'm continuing to advise clients on working in various parts of the Far East. Whoops, okay. So I think I was particularly fortunate at Farrells to get involved in some of the strategic projects the practice was involved in. So that included work for government, for metropolitan government, for the various partnership organizations, which I gather have been largely dismantled in the last 2 years or so. And I think the idea of leadership is actually quite important to understand, because unlike in the UK, where the private sector decides what's going to happen next and the government acts as some kind of referee, in China, all parts of China, in fact all parts of the Far East, whatever the economic system, government's in charge and government's leads, and it determines largely what happens, certainly at the more significant scales. So the work I did on Thames Gateway, for instance, here for the GLA was incredibly useful preparation, because planning is still a big deal in that part of the world. And in fact, as a planner, you have far more status. If you're a planner or an academic, that's an incredibly good start in trying to secure work in China, because you have far more status than a mere architect or engineer. It's really quite an odd inversion. And it was quite a struggle to replace me in the office when I left, because the guys refused to accept that an architect could take the work on, which is of course not true. So that was incredibly useful, having this strategic experience. And Jaya was speaking about this two-way transfer of knowledge. I think there's no question that the experiences that Farrells have had over the last 20 years have been incredibly useful in pursuing and conceptualizing and strategizing on major projects in the UK. So, for instance, the last big project I was involved in here before I set off for Hong Kong and Shanghai was the Earl's Court project, and the fact that the practice had all that years and years of experience with railways and big infrastructure, with tunnels and bridges and so on, I think there's no question that we were able to communicate an expertise. And the thing we kept saying at the interview was, look guys, this is big infrastructure, there's underground lines, there's light rail, there's heavy rail. This is not a job for amateurs. You can't just deck the whole thing over at the cost of 120 million quid. It requires a very kind of creative response to the constraints that underlie that site. And I think that's largely, that played a huge role in securing that work, being able to demonstrate an ability to deal with big infrastructure, to urbanize it, to come up with strategies that allow you to phase development, to come up with strategies that allow a development to respond flexibly over time to changes which nobody can predict. That China experience has been really, really invaluable. And my journey started in Hong Kong, and of course it's got this glamorous harbour with glamorous towers. I think it's got the largest number of buildings over 200 metres in the world, though I suspect that'll be overtaken in the very near future by either Shanghai or Shenzhen, just across the border. But it's so much more than that harbour. It's actually sits in this wonderful South China Sea landscape of islands and mountains and sea, and it's really interesting to reflect that a city that has a reputation for this intensive urbanism is actually 70% of it is nature. That's the land. Let's forget about the sea for the moment. 70% of the land is nature. 60% of the territory's jurisdiction is the equivalent of what is national park. So what's really quite interesting is that it's an urbanism that has responded to in a very particular way to its environment. And for those of you who know Hong Kong, that's Causeway Bay on a Sunday afternoon. That's the run between Times Square and Causeway Bay Station, which is like a football crowd for most of the time. and this is a $60 taxi ride away from Causeway Bay. That's on top of the island looking across what we would call Aberdeen Country Park. It obviously has a Cantonese name, south towards Ap Lai Chau. And the fact is that a city of this density offers incredible quality of life for people from all kinds of social backgrounds and means. So, and $60, by the way, is a fiver. I think it's a bit more than that because the pound has dropped over the last week or so. So that urbanism isn't just about the city. It's about how the city sits in that broader landscape. And the city has always been shaped by this wonderful, I love the maritime chart from the 19th century on the right-hand side, which shows this very challenging topography. And the image looking across towards the island from Kowloon. So it's obviously this wonderful maritime city. So it's been shaped by the fact that it's an international port, but it's also been shaped by the big events of the 20th century, particularly the mid-20th century, when a lot of refugees came over from Guangdong province during the First Revolution to settle in these informal settlements in the northern New Territories. And government responded as it did by turning itself into the world's largest landlord. And that's not something one normally associates with Hong Kong. Hong Kong is seen as this sort of at the outer edges of the free market system. But in fact, it's a sort of shipping and finance and so on, but it's the world's largest landlord. So it's about 2.5 million people live in government housing, and a further percentage live in what we would call affordable housing, which is housing supported by the state in some way. And it's interesting, I think this is a colonial legacy. They named the various sort of iterations of the council house, if I may put it that crudely, in sort of very military terms. So you get Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, Mark 4, Mark 5. And it's interesting issues, I think, for organizations like BRIAM, the way in which government continually tries to update its standards for this housing, its environmental standards, its space standards, and so on. So you have these huge housing estates. They I don't know if they'd work in London, but they're incredibly popular, supported by all social classes. Some of them are modernist masterpieces, in my opinion. If you don't like concrete, don't go anywhere near the Far East, because there's a lot of it. But a great, incredible achievement. And so government does tend to lead from the front. So this is just an extract from a slideshow I was given by the Development Bureau in Hong Kong, and it's just quite incredible to see how they plan for the future. So I went to this sort of jaw-dropping presentation where they say, okay, this is what we've done in the last 10 years, this is what we've done in the last 5 years, this is what's on the books now, this is what's going to happen in 5 years' time, this is what's going to happen in 10 years' time. And you contrast that with the Western European or the UK model where instead of making decisions, government appoints commissions and people tell it what they want, and then out of that stew, you kind of either you do or don't get decisions about what's going to happen. It's a very different system. I think it requires a particular mindset from consultants working there. You do need to understand, and not always obvious, who is your real client or who your client is answerable to. Those are actually quite key questions to get to grips with at the outset of the process. Interestingly, some of the greatest urban achievements in Hong Kong, though, are products of collaboration between government and the private sector. So these are extracts from this wonderful book that Hong Kong University published about 6 months ago called Cities Without Ground. And it describes the three-dimensional nature of Hong Kong's urbanism, in particular its movement systems. So you can get this at the AA bookshop, by the way. But it's well worth a read. And the diagram on the right shows that network in central on Hong Kong Island and TST in Kowloon. It's incredibly, I think, effective and special movement system that copes with these huge densities, and it creates whole different kinds of public realm. This is actually the government part of the network. This is the mid-levels escalator going up the mountain. Really an indispensable adjunct to the pedestrian movement system, given the steep terrain. And it's interesting to reflect that at certain densities, these three-dimensional networks actually don't detract from the wonderful urbanism. People often say, oh, there's no kind of public realm in places like Hong Kong and other Asian cities. But in fact, some of the best streets are to be found in Chinese cities. Perhaps not the sort of best squares or the best this and the best gardens and so on, but you get these wonderful streets, and that's Pottinger Street, just near the mid-level escalator in Central. And that's again another wonderful diagram from the guys at University of Hong Kong, showing the tunnels, the at-grade connections, the overhead connections, and it does give you a different kind of public realm. So on the image on the left is the IFC, the very glamorous shopping centre by, I think it's Cesar Pelli. He certainly designed the towers above it. And those have actually become cultural spaces and exhibition spaces, as well as places that form part of a retail plan. And on the right is a exhibition last year by Roger Sturck-Harbour, and they don't even have an office in Hong Kong, but you do get these interesting cultural events happening in this three-dimensional environment, and it's an interesting inversion of what's happening here, where you get the South Bank, which is becoming more commercial, and in fact, so the South Bank is becoming a work environment. I'm an independent consultant. I use the South Bank as part of my workspace. So interestingly, it's interesting how these spaces work. The other thing that makes the city apart, and I started with Hong Kong because in many ways other Chinese cities look at Hong Kong as kind of what China might be in the future. This is what one might call infrastructure intensive urbanism. The detractors of this model call it an MTR fortress. But I think at a certain scale, this development, which is on Victoria Harbour, has so many ingredients. It's got cultural assets, it's got sporting environments, it's got medical things in it, it's got education, it's got the usual offices and 6-star, whatever that is, hotels, and people live there. And unlike in the UK, living on top of infrastructure attracts a huge premium. So these are extremely high value apartments which none of us can afford. And the values there are easily what the very highest values in London would be. And that's some wonderful drawings from the guys at Farrells showing how that's all put together as a three-dimensional piece based on various kinds of infrastructure. And interestingly, originally the whole model for West Kowloon was these podia connected by underground and overground links, so at 20 meters up above ground. And I think the attitude has changed somewhat, interestingly, in response to public opinion. And I think wherever you work in China, you have to be aware of what people think, particularly of significant major developments. Certainly in Hong Kong, but I think increasingly in places like Shanghai and Beijing, the first-tier cities, government does carefully listen when it comes up against opposition. I think it has no choice. And certainly in Hong Kong, the idea that the harbour, Victoria Harbour, gets occupied by very large-scale development has gone out of public favour, and it's very much about public access along the water's edge. These images are from the submission we put together while I was at Farrells in 2008 for the West Kowloon Cultural District, and it's very much about accessibility to Victoria Harbour. That's a section from Foster and Partners, the guys who won an invited international competition. And they've got some criticism from people who say, oh, it's quite a boring master plan, it's just all like these, it's kind of sort of a reinterpretation of urban development in Tsim Sha Toi in Kowloon. But I think it's actually incredibly effective response, and they haven't drawn all the basements, but it's an interpretation of that infrastructure intensive approach to development. And that's the development plan, which I was again involved in as consultants to Mott MacDonald. So Foster's concept plan has been engineered, if you like, as something which can be developed out over quite some time. I think the overall development program is about 20 years for this district. It's interesting that density allows older sort of lifestyle practices to survive, and this is Lanfao Shan on Shenzhen Bay on the Hong Kong side, Northern New Territories, a fishing village which continues to thrive in that 75% of Hong Kong that isn't developed. And that village continues much as it has done for the last 150 years. I mean, there's a very fine Michelin star restaurant there now. They do oysters from Shenzhen Bay, which I've tried, and I'm still here. But it's interesting if you look back from Shenzhen. This is an image from Shenzhen. I'm sorry I took it with an old iPod, so it's a bit grainy. But on the Hong Kong side, you still have the paddy fields and these wonderful mountain and rural landscapes right next to this huge city. That image is Shenzhen in 1980, and for any of you who've been there, that's quite a statement about the speed of development and the level of ambition and the will to make something happen. That's Shenzhen again in 1980, sort of the sleepy South Guangdong Pearl River Delta town. That was the main square. The most staggering thing about this image is there's no cars there. I think it'd be very hard to take a photograph anywhere in Shenzhen that doesn't have a car appearing in it now. And it was all down to, it was like an experiment really by Deng Xiaoping, apologies for the pronunciation, to actually create a new kind of city right next to Hong Kong. And this was a competition that I led at Farrells. It was almost the first thing I did in China, which is for a new settlement in Shenzhen at the western extremity. And the idea here was that this would be like a new sort of high-quality development on the edge. And we were helped by the engineers who brought you Chepalap Airport to look at all the hydrodynamics and so on. And in competition with people like Jurdy, an American practice, and DCM from Australasia, who used to be very big out there, we came up with this sort of urban strategy for this settlement. It was actually just a reclamation project, but we thought, why not detach it and create an island? And the following sequence, we've all done this, look through our Google Earth history tab. But the following sequence shows you what actually happened. So this is when Deng Xiaoping made the announcement about Shenzhen. That's in 1990, quite a lot of urban development in the central area. This is when, in 2000, when we did the competition. So at this stage, Shenzhen is the size of London population-wise, 7.5 million. That's only 10 years ago. And look at that. That's now. So where our little island was, has become a container port in this huge industrial area. And that's probably the right thing to have happened because it's on the industrial side of Shenzhen. And the lesson there, I suppose, is one, that the urban revolution is taking place now as we speak. And secondly, sometimes you get asked to do things as government actually tests policy and ideas by inviting international consultants to come up with propositions for sites. And that's it today. And in fact, I took this photograph last year, and they've put in this huge expressway going north to the airport since that Google Earth image was made. I think it's a testimony. The images on the right are a testimony to the endurability of life forms on the planet, because you still have that kind of thing happening amongst the container cranes. And actually, there's still some more wildlife left bottom right. So Shenzhen's a place of huge revolutionary rapid growth, but it's also a place of opportunity. And I think what I found over the years is that sometimes the development model is something you'll never have come across before. This is the site of K100, which is a major Farrells mixed-use development with a tall tower on it in central Shenzhen, Kaukaway village. And what the developer did was he formed it wasn't him, it was him in collaboration with so-called villages. On the right-hand side is what's described as a Shenzhen village, very densely packed 6 to 8 story villas and apartment buildings. The developer actually got everybody bar one, the guy in the middle, to form a company, and they approached the government to say, the guy, he said to the community, he said, look, I want to put in this sort of big retail mall and big towers and all that kind of thing in this location. If we come up with an idea and present it to government, let's see where it goes. And in fact, this guy, who was an inexperienced, he wasn't a developer, a construction guy, managed to persuade government that it was the right thing to do. And I think it's extraordinary achievement on the social side as well as on the development side, and I can't imagine that happening in London or anywhere in Western Europe. So things are different. These are the images the Farrells guys show everybody, nice shiny tower, quite elegant, very popular in China and Shenzhen itself. But I think the real achievement is in the urban design. You have a very high density development. I think the floor area ratio is about 12, which is about 4 or 5 times what it is in central London, the West End. But it actually sits very comfortably in its surroundings, and a lot of that is to do with the clever retail planning and the way in which shopping malls can be successful urban entities. I mean, I was showing some guys from China around London 4 or 5 weeks ago, and they just laughed when they saw Stratford. They said, like, where's everything? Oh, there's a shopping centre over the bridge over there. It's just like a model, I think, that we can learn from, not apply directly, but there are ingredients that are applicable here in the UK. So the top image is the shiny rendering from the Farrells guys. The bottom images are some of my pictures of the surrounding streets with the inevitable Starbucks umbrellas on the left-hand side. But it's actually quite successful urbanism, and it coexists with its surroundings. It doesn't oppress, and a lot of that is to do with how the podium is designed and how the mall has been configured. What's quite interesting in China is that a lot of the shops, it doesn't tend to happen in the UK, a lot of the shops face the street, particularly the high-end brands, because their customers do not want to go up escalators. They want to pull up outside, go into the Burberry shop or whatever it might be, and get picked up and disappear. So they do not want to go into that maze. And it's actually quite interesting from an urban point of view, because you do have double-sided shops in shopping malls.